So now that we've done an overview, we're going to start to break down each of these components of the respiratory system, starting with the upper respiratory tract. So the upper respiratory tract is going to include the nasal cavities, pharynx, and larynx. So this whole region right up here. The nose is going to open into the nares, or the nostrils, which lead back into the nasal cavities. The nasal cavities are going to be separated from each other by a septum composed of bone and cartilage. Now inside, or lining these nasal passageways, are going to be hairs that filter the air and trap small particles so they don't enter the passageways back here. Keep in mind that the respiratory system is a direct link from the outside world into our circulatory system. So you're going to see as we move through the respiratory system, as we move from the outside world into the inside world, there's going to be a lot of steps that involve the filtration and the filtration of air and the destruction of pathogens before we reach the circulatory system. So the nose is going to open up from those nostrils into the nasal passageways, and then we're going to move back into the nasopharynx. These nasal cavities, like I said, they have those hairs to help trap and filter small particles, but it's also going to be lined with a mucous membrane. The mucous membrane is going to help trap those particles and move them towards the pharynx. Once they're in the pharynx, they can actually be swallowed or expectorated. So you could spit them out, you could blow them out of your nose, or you could swallow them. Now, if you swallow those things, where are we going to end up? So I'm going to just leave that open-ended for you. But if we were to swallow those particles, where are they going to end up, and how does our body protect itself against those particles that we may be swallowing? So under the mucus layer, there is what is known as the submucosa. So that's going to contain a lot of capillaries to help warm and moisten the incoming air. The abundance of capillaries makes us susceptible to nosebleeds. So it's those capillaries that are found in these nasal passageways that can be damaged and lead to a nosebleed. Now, this region up in here, this does contain odor receptors that are going to help us to detect flavors and odors in our foods, well, in just the world around us. The tear glands in the eyes are going to drain down into the nasal cavities by way of tear ducts. So if you've ever noticed, if your eyes become very runny, this could lead to your nose becoming runny. When I put in my contacts, it doesn't affect my nose in any way. I'm not putting my contacts in my nose. I'm not doing anything. But it does cause my eyes to water, which will drain down into my nose, and I always have to blow my nose after putting my contacts in. So this is why crying causes a runny nose. So the nasal cavities also connect with the sinuses of the skull. Now, fluid can accumulate in these sinuses, causing an increase in pressure, and a sinus headache is passage and fluid buildup, it's fluid and pressure buildup in those nasal cavities. Air the nasal cavities passes into the nasopharynx, which is the upper portion of the pharynx. Now, we're going to see this a little bit later on when we talk about our different senses. There are also going to be auditory tubes known as eustachian tubes that connect to the region back here. These are going to connect the nasopharynx to the middle ear. Now, the reason that I'm mentioning this is because this is going to come up a little bit later on when we talk about the middle ear, and we talk about how we are able to regulate and maintain pressure in the middle ear behind that eardrum. So when air pressure inside the middle ears equalizes with the air pressure in the nasopharynx, the auditory tube openings may create sort of that popping sensation. So you may have heard individuals talk about, oh, my ears popped, or we went up in an airplane and changed the altitude caused my ears to pop. That's because the opening of the eustachian tube into the nasopharynx has opened up, and it's equalizing the pressure in your middle ear. So the pharynx, as we mentioned previously, is going to be this funnel-shaped cavity that connects the nasal and oral cavities to the larynx. Now, right back here, you might see these small structures. Remember when we talked about our tonsils? Our tonsils are going to be made out of a lymphoid tissue at the junction of the oral cavity and the pharynx. These are going to help provide a defense against inhaled pathogens. Now, the larynx is going to be this portion right down here. It's a cartilaginous structure between the pharynx and the trachea. This is where you might see the Adam's apple, which is the laryngeal prominence. It's going to be located right here at the front of the neck. Down inside of the larynx, we're going to see, this is also referred to as the voice box. The reason is because it contains the vocal cords. The vocal cords are what allow us to pass air over our vocal cords, allows us to speak and form words and structure. And this region right here is also going to contain the epiglottis. That epiglottis is the flap of cartilage which covers the airway when swallowing. So every time, generally speaking, the epiglottis is raised and open, but every time you swallow, it's going to slam shut and prevent anything from flowing down into your trachea. So this right here is just going to be a structure of those vocal cords. These are mucosal folds that are supported by elastic ligaments. Now, the slit between the vocal cords is called the glottis. When air passes through the glottis, the vocal cords vibrate back and forth. This produces a sound. Now, the greater the tension in the vocal cords, the higher the pitch. When the glottis is wider, the pitch is lower. The loudness depends on the degree to which those vocal cords vibrate. So opening and closing determines pitch, and then the amplitude of the vibration determines the volume. When food is swallowed, the larynx is going to move upward against the epiglottis and a flap of tissue that prevents food, upward against the epiglottis, which is just that flap of tissue that prevents food from going down into our trachea. All right, so you should be able to describe the functions of each of the structures in the upper respiratory tract, name and briefly describe the body systems that have a connection with the pharynx. So you should go back over the different systems that are all connected to that pharynx. We've already talked about one of them. And then you should also briefly just explain how sound is produced in the body. I'm not going to expect you to go into any great depth, but I do find it interesting and curious, so spend just a little bit of time reading over that section.